Okay. Now, what if you go to a unit that has more than five, some kind of an apartment complex, or even a place that has uh, duplexes or quadplexes, but there's more. There's five, six, seven, eight, 10 of them, right? So you got more. Well, let's take a look at what the law says about that. For an indoor treatment at a residential rental property with five or more units, the certified applicator or technician must make the consumer information sheet available to the owner or manager of the complex. The certified applicator or technician must also supply the owner or manager with the pest control sign. The owner or manager must notify residents of the treatment by posting the sign in a common area of the residence at least 48 hours before the treatment. Okay, so what it's saying here is if you got a place that has 5 units or more, then what you can do is you can give a copy of the consumer information sheet to the owner or the manager. Now you also will get a copy of a sign. There's an official sign that you can print out. You can go to the website, to the Texas Department of Agriculture, and you will go to the Structural Pest Control Services Division, and under forms you can print these forms out and get the official sign. It's important that you use the right sign in the right size and the right letters and all that, so that it's legal and up to the rules. And you would give them the owner, not each individual person living in the unit, but just one consumer information sheet and one sign. And then on this sign, it's going to say when the treatment is going to be and what you're going to do. And he can post that sign in a common area, wherever that might be, in the office or in the rec room or in the washroom or whatever that might be. He can post that sign so that everybody can see when the treatment's going to be. So you don't have to go around to each unit and do it yourself. By law, all you're required to do is to give the sign and the consumer information sheet to the owner or the manager, and then it's their responsibility to post that at least 48 hours before you do the treatment. Now, whether they post it or not, you can't force them to do that. That's not your job. That what all your job is to do is to supply them with the sign and with the consumer information sheet, and then it's up to them to do what they're supposed to do, which is post it. So you're just, by law, you're just required to supply the sign. You don't have to post it. Okay? Okay, now for a pest control treatment at a workplace, let's talk about that for just a minute. If you do a treatment in a workplace where they have employees there, and then say an office building of some sort, and there's all different kinds of them, but you're required to give this information to them as well. And let's take a look at what the law says about that. All right, it says, for an indoor treatment at a workplace, the certified applicator or technician must make the consumer information sheet available and supply a pest control sign to the employer or the building manager. The building manager or the employer must notify individuals at the workplace of the date of the planned treatment by posting a sign in a common area at least 48 hours before the planned treatment. Okay. So here again, if you're going to do a pest control treatment in a business, it's kind of the same thing if you're doing 5 or more units. What you need to do is you need to make the consumer information sheet and a sign available to the business. It can either be the like the manager there at the business, or sometimes in the case of very large businesses, if you're doing a really big building, they may have a building manager, and you would give the building manager the sign and the consumer information sheet. then there again, it's their responsibility to post this at least 48 hours before the treatment, letting the people know somewhere in a common area in that building where people can see the sign. Okay, let's take a look at the consumer information sheet. This is what it looks like, and in this you're going to want to know some of the things that are in here. It starts off with the statement that the structural pest control industry is regulated by the Texas Department of Agriculture. The Structural Pest Control Service, in their P.O. box, it has their address in there. And it says that certified applicators and technicians must pass a written examination in order to receive their license. So right off the top here, in this consumer information sheet, they're letting people know that you had to pass a test to get your license. So there again, take some pride in that and let people know that you are certified and licensed and you had to pass a test to do that. A little bit farther down in the consumer information sheet, it says this. It says, if you suspect a violation of the law regarding structural pest control, contact the Structural Pest Control Service. If you are contracting for pest control service due to a home solicitation, you have the right to cancel that contract within 72 hours. Just know that in the first part of this consumer information sheet that they're telling people that you've had to pass an exam to get your license. So take some pride in the fact that you've passed the test and you've gone through the classes and you've done the on-the-job training, and that you know what you're doing and that you've been trained the right way to do the pest control. And let people know this. There's nothing wrong with that. And when you tell somebody that you've had to do that, and then they get the sheet and they read in there that, it says right here you've had to pass an exam to get your license, then that lends credibility to what you're telling them. So that's always a good thing. So take some time, sit down and read through the consumer information sheet when you get a chance, just so that you know what it is that you're giving people to read. All right? Okay, so here's a copy of the consumer information sheet. Take some time to look at this and read it over. This is what you are required to give other people when you go to their houses or their business, so it's good to know what's on there. So take a little time and take a look at this and see what's on that consumer information sheet. Okay, let's talk about Rule 7.150, General Standards for Use of Pesticides. So we're going to talk a little bit about what the law says about following the label on the pesticides. Okay, to start with, it says, use of a pesticide shall be made consistent with the pesticide's labeling. Use inconsistent with the pesticide label includes, but is not limited to, applications at sites, rates, concentrations, intervals, or under conditions not specified in the labeled directions. Okay, so what it's talking about here is it's saying that use of a pesticide shall be made consistent with the pesticide's labeling. In other words, what the label says is what you have to do. You may want to use more pesticide than what it says, or you may want to try to kill some insects that aren't on that label. You can't do that. You have to follow the label. So pretty much our directions are pretty simple. We just follow the label. So now it's going to talk about some of the things it says that the use inconsistent with the labels include but is not limited to. Okay, so these are things that's inconsistent with that. In other words, applications at sites, rates, concentrations, intervals, or under conditions specified in the labeled directions. Okay. Number 2, tank mixing of pesticides or using application techniques or equipment prohibited by the label. Okay, so they're saying that you need to read the label and make sure, first of all, that where you're applying the application is allowed on there. If it's might happen to be a school or a house, if it's outside or indoors, you need to check that label and make sure that it's applied, that it's labeled to apply it in those places that you want to do it. It's also saying that you have to follow the procedures and in other words, the way it puts it is tank mixing or using application techniques or equipment prohibited by the label. So, in other words, if it's not on the tank on the label that you can tank mix it, then you cannot do that. You have to apply it in the way that the label says. And number 3 is failure to observe reentry intervals. Okay, so that would be what they're saying is if the label says do not allow people back into that area for a certain amount of time, and if you do not follow that rule, that would be considered inconsistent with the label, and you can be cited for doing anything that's inconsistent with the label. Now, most of these labels will say not to allow people to be in the immediate area while you're treating. So you need to make sure that that happens. It may also say not to allow people back into the area until the product has dried. So there, you have to think about how long is it going to take for it to dry. You know, is it going to take, is it a hot day? Is it a cold day? Is it inside or outside? All of these things factor into that. So when you're telling the customer and they ask you, how long do I need to wait before I come back in? You may want to just say, wait 2 hours or wait 3 hours. But you can't really just say a time frame, because if the label says not to allow them back into the house or into that area until it's dry, and if it takes 4 or 5 or 6 hours for it to dry, then they have to wait however long that is. So it's best to inform your customers of this. Don't just say, well, you can go back in 30 minutes, or you can go back in 2 hours. Tell them, well, in 2 hours, check and see and make sure that it's dry. And if it's dry, you can go back in. But if it's not, then you may need to wait a couple more hours until it's completely dry before you enter that area. Now, that would be following the label. That's what the label says. And being a professional, part of your job is helping these people and guiding them in knowing the right and proper procedures. You're the professional. You're supposed to read these labels, understand them, and then explain it to the customer and make sure that they follow those rules. Let's see what else it says under the same rule. Rule 7.150. It says here, a pesticide shall not be used if the complete label is not available and the pesticide's identity is not known. The words unknown pesticide, hazardous materials shall be written on the container. The pesticide shall be stored and disposed of in accordance with all state and federal laws. All right. So this is an interesting one to look at here. It says here that a pesticide shall not be used if the complete label is not available. it's not unusual at all when you've got these pesticide containers and you're putting them in and out of your toolbox or the back of the truck or whatever it is you carry your pesticides in, that these labels start to wear away or they fall off, or the name could get rubbed off. And if you've had that container in there with 5 or 6 other jugs and the labels are coming off, it's possible that you could end up pulling out a container and looking at it not knowing really what it is. You might say, well, I think it's Telstar, it's white, it's that kind of a bottle, but then again it could be Suspend SC, so I'm not really sure. So if that happens, technically the law says under this law that you cannot use that pesticide. If you don't know what it is, you don't know what the label says, you can't follow those laws and those rules. So what you have to do is write on that container, unknown pesticide, hazardous material. Then you have to dispose of that the way that the law calls for it. Typically, all of these pesticides have to be disposed of in the same way. You have to take them to a center where they will dispose of toxic materials. And so here's what I do. If a label starts wearing off, or sometimes even as soon as I buy a bottle and I know that it has a kind of label on it that has the tendency to maybe start coming off or can be tore off, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a Sharpie. I usually have one laying around here somewhere, and I keep one in my truck just for this reason. But I'll take out that little permanent marker, and I will write on the label or on the bottle what the product is. I'll write on there, Suspend or Telstar or Termidor. Then that way, if the label does come off, I know what it is, and it's not a problem. So now this is one of those things that they will look at when they come and inspect you. They're going to want to go and look at your vehicle and see the pesticide containers that you have, and they want to make sure that they're all labeled. One time I had a blue 5-gallon square water jug. It was just full of water in the back of my truck, and I had just written on it H2O in the corner. And they were inspecting my truck, and they saw that blue jug, and they didn't see where I had written what it was in there. And he was about to write me up for that. And I pointed out to him, I did label it. It says right there, H2O. And when he looked at it, he thought about it for a minute, and he thought, oh, H2O, that's water. And he said, okay. And he kind of laughed, and he didn't write me up. So any containers that are on your vehicle, make sure that it's labeled what it is. Even if it's just a water jug, make sure you label on it. I even have a bucket that I keep on there with the lid. It's just for trash. I wrote on there, trash only. So everything is labeled. That way you don't have to worry about if an inspector comes along and says, hey, let's take a look at what's going on in your truck. You know that you're good. Okay, now, with that being said, let's take a look at the next rule, which is Rule 7.151. Now, this is the general standards for storage and disposal of pesticides. All right, so let's take a look at what this rule says. Storage and disposal of a pesticide and or its container shall be made consistent with the pesticide's labeling. Okay, so I've got here, and I'll show you, here's a bottle where the labels come off. And or it might be just the case of this bottle, I don't think might not have ever had a label. Sometimes you can just buy these bottles, the small ones. If you buy the big jugs, and you can refill these. So in that case, I wrote right on it, Tarrant SC, what the product is. Wrote it on both sides, so that's up to code. But usually when you buy these pesticides, they're going to come with a label on the bottle. And these labels, in this case, here's what just the label would look like as the sticker, but this one is made where you can tear this off and you can have the complete label. And these labels can be quite extensive depending on the product. In this case, it's a little booklet. It's got, let's see, 47 pages to it. So there's a lot in this label. So whenever I first got into applying pesticides in the pest control business, I would get a pesticide, or whenever I got a new pesticide that I'd never used before, I would get that bottle, pull this label off, put it in my pocket, and I would take this label with me everywhere I went, and every chance I had when I wasn't doing something. If I was just sitting there at lunch, eating lunch or something, I would open this up and start reading through it. And I would read every bit of it over and over again. And there's charts in here. Sometimes there's charts that tell you with different application rates, and there's things that you need to know about these labels. That you can read them, and there's different application rates. There might be 3 different levels that you can apply at, and so you want to know what you can do and what you can't do. You also want to know, in this case, we're talking about storing pesticides. That will all be in here. All that information will be in here. It'll tell you how this product has to be stored, and how you have to dispose of the container, and those kind of things. So, when it comes to storage and disposal of a pesticide or its container, shall be made consistent with the pesticide labeling. So whatever that label says, that's how you have to do it. 9 times out of 10, your pesticide labels are going to tell you, if they come in a jug like this, it's going to tell you that after you get done using this, that you have to triple rinse and then puncture the bottle. And we'll talk more about that, but that's very important. And that's another one of those things that I have actually had an inspector ask me, tell me what you do with your pesticide bottles when you're done, containers when you're done with them. And I told him, I said, I do exactly what the label says. And he goes, okay, tell me what the label says. And I said, triple rinse and puncture. And he says, okay, that's what I'm looking for. So if they ask you what you're doing with your pesticide containers when you're done with them, make sure that you tell them that you're going to triple rinse and puncture. They want to make sure that you're doing that. And please make sure that you do that. It's very important for our environment, and we're going to talk more about that later on. Okay, next under this, Rule 7.151, we're still talking about general standards for storage and disposal of pesticides. So the next thing it says is that no person may dispose of, discard, or store any pesticide or pesticide container in a manner that may cause injury or result as an injury to humans, vegetation, crops, livestock, wildlife, pollinating insects, or pollution of any water or waterway. All right. This is very important. They're going to be looking to make sure that when the way you store these things, if there's a leak or something happens, or the way you're disposing of them, that this stuff doesn't get down into the dirt. In the state of Texas especially, it's very important. A lot of the water that we use out in West Texas comes from what's known as aquifers. That's underwater rivers. And if these products can build up in the environment, rain and floods happen, and then when it absorbs and it goes down into the soil, that chemical could end up into a city's water supply, totally polluting their water. It could be a real disaster. So this is very important that we make sure that we have control of these pesticides. We know what they are, what the labels say, where they are, how we're storing them. Make sure that we are thinking about what's going to happen if something goes wrong. What happens if something happens and there's a spill or there's a leak here? We want to think ahead and make sure we prevent those kind of things from happening. And so it even talks about pollinating insects. So in other words, you don't want a pesticide to leak out and get to where bees could come along and get into it, especially if it's a product, something like Tarrant. Tarrant SC is a good example, which is also like Termidor. That product, if an insect gets in it, it doesn't kill them right away. They carry it back to them to the hive, and it spreads to the rest of the hive. If you allow a product to say leak out, and you have a beekeeper that's in a farm that's next to you, and those bees get in there, and it could completely wipe out that whole colony of bees. I have seen bees that have been several colonies destroyed by getting into pesticides. And so this can cause economical damage. It can cause damage to the environment, and it's not something that you want to have happen. So to prevent these things, you want to think about it, and remember, it's in the law that we have to prevent this. So the next thing is, in this law, it says the applicator, the owner of the pesticide, and or the person in control of mixing shall be jointly and severely liable for proper storage and disposal of the pesticides, the containers, and the contents. Okay, so that means that just because you work for somebody else, that doesn't release you of the liability. If you do something that allows a spill or doesn't store this pesticide right, that causes damage in some way to vegetation, livestock, crops, wildlife, insects, bees, or especially a water supply system for a city, you are responsible and you're liable. These are charges that can be brought against you under this law, and you could lose your license. You can get fines. So you want to make sure that you control where you're storing your pesticides, and make sure you have control of how you're getting rid of those old containers when you're done with them. The name on either the pesticide label or the specimen label shall be written on the pesticide container if the name of the pesticide is not on the pesticide container and the pesticide's identity is known. Okay? So there again, when you get these bottles, they come with a label on them, and if that label for some reason is gone and you know what was in there and you're sure what it was, then you can just write it on there. Okay? You're legal. That's what it says in this law. It says that and defined in 76.023 of the Texas Agriculture Code. Okay, so if the label comes off, make sure you write it on there. I always carry a marker in my truck so that just for that reason, so I can write on these containers if I need to. Okay, next it says that a person storing a pesticide shall maintain a complete label of that pesticide in hard copy form for as long as the pesticide is being stored. Okay, so like I showed you earlier, I pull these pesticide labels off, and this is a hard copy of the label, and I have a file that I keep in my truck, and I keep all of these, whatever it is. If I have 6 or 7 or 10 different pesticides, I'm going to have 10 different labels in my truck, because that's where I store my pesticides. If you buy a bottle and for some reason it doesn't have this label that you can detach from it, then what you can do is you can go online and just pull up the label for that pesticide and print it out and keep that in your truck, and that will keep you up to code.